So good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
So I love that song, Kumbaya. I read something kind of interesting recently that there is a African-American community in South Carolina called the Gullah Geechee, and they have an interesting language that's made up of West African dialects and almost like Elizabethan English. And they were recently given back the rights to Kumbaya, which is a really cool thing given that so much of the creations of so many African Americans have been appropriated over time. So I thought that was kind of a cool thing. So thank you, choir, for offering that to us. So good morning again. My name is Eli Poor, and I use they, their pronouns. I'm a proud queer, non-binary, Unitarian Universalist, a partner, parent, musician, a seminarian, a person in long-term recovery, and a member of U2C3. And if you don't know what some of that means, please see me after the service, and I'll be happy to fill you in. I'm pleased to be with you as your lay leader today, and I'm super excited to be in the pulpit today exploring this topic of queering church during Pride Week. So believe it or not, that was completely unintentional, but what a happy accident it was. So as most of you know, June marks the celebration of Pride Month, and let me ask just very quickly, and LGBTQ community members, you guys can set this one out, see how well you know your LGBTQ history, and it's an easy one, but little pop quiz here. Why is Pride Month celebrated in June? Anybody know? Stonewall riots, awesome. And you guys included the riot part. Some people leave that part out, but my anarchist punk rock inner child think that it's really important to include that, because after all, the angry mob of trans women, butch lesbians, drag queen, hustlers, and prostitutes didn't invite the police over for a nice cup of tea and a friendly chat. So just a quick bit about these riots, which reportedly, by varying accounts, they involved an impromptu drag queen kickline chorus singing a body rendition of Tarara Boondie, which I'm not going to share with you this morning, to taunt the police, and also trans icon Marsha P. Pay It No Mind Johnson apparently took a parking meter that had been removed from its station by the crowd, brandished it, and smashed the windshield of a police cruiser. So that's kind of exciting. So these riots took place over a 2-day period at the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village, New York in June of 1969. Members of the LGBTQ community who had faced police harassment and brutality basically resisted police intervention and detention after a raid, and they rioted over a 2-day period. And this event was really important and ultimately energized the community and ultimately led to the gay liberation movement that began in the 1970s. And the first Pride Parade and the first Gay Pride March in U.S. history was held 1 year later on June 28th of 1970, and it was known then as the Christopher Street Liberation Day March, after the street on which the Stonewall Inn was located. And since then, each June, neighborhoods and cities across the world have continued to hold these events annually as celebrations of visibility, diversity, tenacity, and the general colorful fabulousness of the queer and trans community in honor of those first revolutionaries. And yesterday, I was pleased to see a few members of U2C3 out and about at the Pride Parade. And to those of you who came, thank you so much for making our church visible at this important event. It was really hot, but it was awesome, and it's so important to have representation of faith communities at these events because so much harm has been done to the LGBTQ community in the name of so-called faith. So since joining this church, I've been pleased to participate in previous marches, which actually started out in Corpus Christi in years past as a march for marriage equality back before June of 2015, when the Supreme Court ruled in Obergefell v. Hodges in favor of marriage equality nationwide. Though there were a few in the LGBTQ community that thought that the ruling was the be-all, end-all of the movement for civil rights, I don't think that anyone expected at that time that, unfortunately, just a short year later, our country would see an emboldened right-wing movement that would threaten our families, our communities, our jobs, our livelihood, and in some cases, even our lives. For the past few years across the country, we've seen bigotry in action in state and federal legislatures, in the Supreme Court, and the White House. It's been spewed by family members and friends on social media. We've seen religious communities whose doctrine has long been the source of much bigotry with regard to the LGBTQIA community stiffen their practice of disinclusion of queer and trans folks. Most recently, with the United Methodist Church's vote to restrict avowed and practicing homosexuals from ordination and refusal to conduct same-sex weddings within their churches, actions that prevent countless clergy members from pursuing their callings to ministry within their church, and prevents parishioners from having their marriages recognized by their faith communities, and it continues to uphold centuries of bigotry and oppression disguised as religious doctrine, rather than promoting the radically inclusive gospel of Jesus Christ, who, to be frank, I think would be appalled at what some of the believers have done in his name. But before we feel too smug as Unitarian Universalists, while we're no doubt having some really important conversations and doing some really great work with regard to LGBTQIA+ issues, many of our congregations, regardless of the number of rainbows that might adorn the walls, struggle with the same bias, prejudices, and simple lack of understanding as other faith traditions, with particular regard to the trans community. On January 22nd, the UU organization TRUST, which stands for Transgender Religious Professional UUs Together, released a report on the experiences of trans Unitarian Universalists. In 2019, the year that celebrates the 30th anniversary of the Welcoming Congregation program, with 75% of UU congregations, including ours, having gone through the program, TRUST reports that only 28% of trans UUs feel that their congregation is completely inclusive of them as trans people. That 42% of trans UUs regularly experience trans-related marginalization in UU spaces, and fewer than half of trans UUs feel spiritually nourished and connected, quote, within their congregations. Furthermore, the survey reveals that trans UUs are more likely to be low-income, young, disabled, racially diverse, and lesbian, gay, bisexual, or pansexual, or queer than the general UU population. And the more marginalized identities that they possess, the less likely they are to experience inclusion within their congregations. For example, only 15% of trans UUs of color feel their congregation is completely inclusive of them as trans people, and only 10% of Black trans UUs feel that way. Trans clergy entering parish ministry have a difficult time finding congregations to call them. And most recently, there was an article published in UU World that, while well-intended, did tremendous harm both in its assumptions about the trans community and through its choice of centering on a cisgender, heterosexual, white female perspective, effectively objectifying trans people in the process. The kicker is that while UU World editors did the right thing and contacted trans UUs for advice on the article's publication, they decided to publish anyway after being advised against it. All of this while transphobia runs rampant, and trans folks, particularly trans women of color, face staggering instances of assault and murder, which shows just how disposable your life is when you embody multiple marginalized identities. The LGBTQIA community, and in particular the trans community, needs safe and affirming spiritual communities now more than ever. And I believe in my heart of hearts that Unitarian Universalists can provide such a community for us and for everyone. However, TRUST's sobering report indicates that we've got to do more than we've been doing. It also points out how essential recognizing the intersections of gender, race, class, sexual orientation, disability, and age is in this endeavor, because after all of these things are connected. We can't and shouldn't talk about transphobia without talking about white supremacy, classism, sexism, ableism, or misogyny. So what do we do with all of this? The isms are daunting. They're big systemic issues after all. One could seemingly drown in them. How can any one person, one church, or one denomination hope to make any sort of a difference? And how do we challenge ourselves and one another to do more while staying in covenant and remaining connected to our larger purpose and the evolving needs of those diverse communities? So, to start off this conversation, I want to talk a little bit about privilege. Privilege is a word that you hear tossed around pretty frequently in social justice spaces, and some people understand the concept relatively easily, while others seem to find it confusing and need a little more help. While it would seem that this term and concept is a modern one, it actually goes back to the 1930s with the writing of W.E.B. Du Bois, who of course was a historian, a sociologist, the first African-American to earn a PhD from Harvard University, and the co-founder of the NAACP. He writes, "It must be remembered that the white group of laborers, while they received a low wage, were compensated in part by a sort of public and psychological wage. They were given public deference and titles of courtesy because they were white. They were admitted freely with all classes of white people to public functions, public parks, and the best schools. The police were drawn from their ranks, and the courts, dependent on their votes, treated them with such leniency as to encourage lawlessness. Their votes selected public officials, and while this had small effect upon the economic situation, it had great effect upon their personal treatment and the deference shown them. White schoolhouses were the best in the community and conspicuously placed, and they cost anywhere from twice to 10 times as much per capita as the colored schools. The newspapers specialized on news that flattered the poor whites and almost utterly ignored the Negro except in crime and ridicule." Essentially, Du Bois describes a process that divided the labor movement by leading low-wage white workers to feel a sense of superiority to low-wage black workers. And this wasn't just limited to the United States or to the American South. Du Bois identified white supremacy as a global phenomenon, affecting the social conditions across the world by the means of colonialism. Later on, in the 1980s, the American feminist scholar and activist Peggy McIntosh published an article entitled "White Privilege and Male Privilege," a personal account of coming to see the correspondences through work in women's studies. In this writing, McIntosh expands the discussion of privilege to include the intersections of race, gender, class, and sexuality, and encourages individuals to reflect on and recognize their own unearned advantages and disadvantages as parts of immense and overlapping systems of power. So, in this tradition, I'd like to take a brief moment to reflect on our individual privileges. The psychological wages, to reference Du Bois, that we've been granted simply by being a part of a privileged majority. And my intention with this exercise isn't to shame anyone. You don't have to raise your hand, but rather I just want to demonstrate how deeply ingrained some of these unearned privileges are and just how much they affect our daily lives. There are things that many of us don't consider because they've been a part of our lives for as long as we can remember. We all interact with systems that either work to elevate us or to limit us. Many of us are privileged in some ways and limited in others. This list of examples is by no means inclusive, but here are just a few. Do people not assume that you constantly need help or saving? Are you not seen as being unattractive or undesirable because of disabilities? Congratulations, you are at least temporarily able-bodied. Do you own your home, or do you have a 4-year college degree? Were you able to pay all of your bills this month and even have enough left over to buy groceries? Have you never looked into a paycheck advance business or never used one? If you find yourself in a legally perilous situation, can you hire an attorney and ensure your case is heard justly? If so, then you are likely economically privileged. Are you unafraid when you're pulled over by the police, and do you generally have a positive relationship with law enforcement? Have you never had to educate your children on what to do to avoid being injured or even killed by law enforcement during a routine traffic stop? While you were young, could you find children's books that overwhelmingly represent your race? If so, then you are a beneficiary of white supremacy. Are you able to show affection to your significant other without fearing for your or their physical safety? Can you expect to be around others of your sexuality most of the time? Do you not worry about being fired for your sexual orientation? Hello, heterosexual privilege. Are you able to easily find and use a public restroom that corresponds to your gender identity? Is your validity as a man, woman, or human not based on how much surgery you've had or how well you pass as non-transgender? Can you walk through the world and generally blend in, not being constantly stared at, whispered about, pointed at, or laughed at because of your gender expression? Can you access gender-exclusive spaces, e.g. a space or activity for women due to your trans status? You guessed it, you have unearned cisgender privilege. Do you have legislators worrying about or limiting your reproductive health choices? Can you disregard your appearance and not worry about being criticized at work or in social situations? Do most religious leaders and political representatives share your gender? Congratulations, you probably have male privilege. So these are just a few examples, but as shown, our lives and our choices are so deeply affected by so many things about which we have no control. Systems of oppression are in operation all around us all the time. They operate in our work lives, in our home lives, in our neighborhoods, government, police force, in our judicial systems. They operate in our churches, temples, and our synagogues. And they are in operation here in this congregation right now, today. We can't challenge these deeply rooted systems overnight, and we won't nullify their effects simply by recognizing them. But we can't do anything about them if we pretend that we're exempt from their influence or fail to recognize their fingerprints in our lives and on our institutions. Being willing to talk about and recognize the places where we hold privilege is one of the first steps in lessening its effects on those that are so deeply affected by its absence. As Unitarian Universalists, we have a whole lot of unearned privilege. Our congregations, including this one, are overwhelmingly educated, middle to upper middle class, white, heterosexual, and cisgender. We have wondered, both here within our church and as a larger faith tradition, that why, despite our progressive and inclusive values, do we not see more diverse representation within our congregations? I think that the answers are complex and that we could dedicate a whole series of sermons and at least one year-long RE curriculum to exploring this question. But from what I've seen, I think some of the reasons for this are at least partially attributable to the fact that despite our rich theological tradition of dissent, questioning, and progressive inclusivity, we have failed to address the ways that our privileges, or rather the oppressive systems that these privileges represent, work through us to contribute to the perpetuation of the status quo. Oppressive systems have the goal of exclusion, of elevating one group to the detriment of another, of separation, of categorizing, of dehumanizing, of reducing a whole person to nothing more than a series of caricatures based on bias and prejudicial judgment. So what is the opposite of this? How do we promote inclusivity, acceptance, connection, and universality in our lives, in our congregations, in our communities, and in the wider world? And what are our obligations as people of faith to do this work within ourselves and our congregations and take our messages to our communities and to the wider world? For centuries, our churches in many ways have been guardians and protectors of the status quo. Innumerable evils have been done in the name of faith and virtue. And among all of these, perhaps some of the greatest of these evils have been silence, complicity, and failure to act. And yet, within these traditions, we find the best of us as well, bastions of hope and inclusivity in figures like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who promoted one of my favorite concepts of all time, beloved community. This concept doesn't refer to some far-off utopia, but rather something attainable in the here and now when we center love, justice, and community in the heart of our work and our lives. Dr. King said, "Power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice is at its best as power correcting everything that stands against love." I'm going to say that again. Justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. For too many years, churches and religious communities have allowed a message of hate and intolerance to drown out the real message of love and inclusivity that lies at the heart of all faiths. We have been complacent in our privileges, watching from the sidelines as great harm has been done to the most marginalized members of our communities, upholding rather than challenging the status quo. This brings me to the idea of queerness. The word queer originally referred to something odd or strange, something out of the ordinary, the opposite of the status quo. By the 1940s in the United States, queer became a pejorative term used to disparage primarily homosexual or effeminate men, or in general, behavior that deviated from heterosexual norms. In the 1980s and early 90s, when LGBTQ activist groups like ACT UP and Queer Nation began to reclaim the term as something positive, indicating a process of questioning mainstream ideas. Around the same time, queer theory began looking at this idea of the status quo, of normativity, particularly of heteronormativity. Queer theory began to deconstruct the idea that you can take a complex human being and place them into binary black or white categories. Judith Butler, the philosopher, gender theorist, and third-wave feminist, first conceived of queer as an action. And from there, queering then became a tool for social and political subversion of the dominant culture, a tool for dismantling oppression and challenging systems. So what does it look like to queer church? How do we challenge and dismantle the systems that over and over again seek equilibrium within the status quo, and by so doing, keep us stuck and separate? How do we recognize and work to address the privilege that has seeped into and tainted our experiences, our perspectives, our churches, our theologies and beliefs, our committees, our leadership structures, our wider communities, and the wider world? How do we work against this tendency that we have to center on white, middle-class, educated, cis, heteronormative experiences, and instead intentionally center and lift up the voices and experiences of those on the margins, not only here within our church, but in our faith tradition as a whole? How are we being the voice that speaks louder than all of the other voices that tell so many people that not only do their neighbors and friends and family and community members and elected leaders believe that they are unworthy of love or dignity or grace, but that the creator of the whole damned universe agrees with them? More specifically, what are we doing to be inclusive of the transgender and non-binary voices within this congregation? Do you know what preferred pronouns are and how to ask which ones an individual might prefer? How are we welcoming and affirming young people, those with disabilities, those who have little or no money to offer in pledges? Are they being included in leadership positions, on committees? Are they being invited to social events outside of church? And more importantly, are they being made to feel welcome here? What are you doing? What am I doing? What are we doing now, here, together, to challenge ourselves to do better, to love more deeply, to listen wholly, to be present to each other, and to those who are desperate and thirsty for the cool waters of authentic community, who need our message of love and inclusivity the most? The rainbow flag of the LGBTQIA+ community is rainbow because it was meant to be inclusive of every single color. A movement that seeks to queer church would likewise be inclusive of all genders, all gender expressions, all orientations, all ethnicities, all abilities, all ages, all faiths. It wouldn't care whether you were a migrant worker, a Black trans woman, a CEO, a sex worker, a butch lesbian, a stockbroker, or a homeless addict. It wouldn't matter if you were Muslim, Jewish, Christian, humanist, Hindu, Buddhist, or atheist, whether you were able-bodied or differently abled. Not only would this queering movement recognize your inherent worth and dignity, it would actively work to dismantle the systems that said you were less capable, less valuable, less worthy, or less loved than anyone else. It would constantly seek to grow, to change, to continually look for those that were being left behind and make sure those folks were included and nourished. Our tradition has a proud history of queering. We've been dissenters, preachers of universal salvation, a God that loves humanity too much to condemn anyone to suffer the torment of hell. We've insisted on the unity of God when it was unpopular. We've been abolitionists, women's suffragists. We preached reason and tolerance. We've been participants in civil disobedience. We've marched with Dr. King at Selma, at the Mall on Washington. We were anti-war protesters. We marched for gay rights in 1993, and recently we stood with Sioux elders at Standing Rock. We've stood with protesters in Ferguson. We've been tear gassed and arrested at the border. One of my favorite quotes is from Viktor Frankl, who says, "That which is to give light must endure burning." This quote speaks to me of the painful necessity of growth and change, and also serves to remind that the hardest things that we do are often the most meaningful and the most transformative. Welcoming, like queering, is a verb. It's an ongoing process that doesn't stop with one event. May we be ever welcoming, ever queering, and ever mindful of those being left out and left behind. May we love courageously, include radically, and may we be bold in queering our church, our theology, our faith, our community, our world, and maybe most importantly, ourselves. May we never stop challenging ourselves to love more, listen more, learn more, and may we always, always, always keep growing. Amen, and blessed be.